I was reminded by listening to the earlier speakers of a conference that I attended probably 15 years ago, looking at the changes in the religious education curriculum in Ireland. One of the speakers started off by telling a story about a priest who was experimenting with a new approach to the children in his church. And he sat them in a little circle one Sunday morning and he said, "Now, I want you to tell me what's small, grey, lives in a tree and eats nuts." And there was complete silence. I said, "Come on, surely one of you must know. Come on, small, grey, has a bushy tail, lives in a tree, and eats nuts." And eventually one brave little boy put his hand up and he said, "Yes, what's the answer?" I said, "Well, Father, I know the answer should be Jesus, but it sounds like a squirrel to me." I say that by way of introduction because from the offset, I don't propose to kind of offer any solutions to the problems facing higher education in Britain today. But in the context of servant leadership, I want to think, some of the things that I've been thinking about over the last few months, since I attended the annual Servant Leadership Conference last fall here in London, which was an extraordinary event, which I'd encourage all of you to attend this year. But some of the things that kind of registered in my mind, some of the questions that I've been asking in relationship to it. Postmodernism is one of those terms that fires the imagination of people concerned with the content of not only our minds but with our culture. Does it exist, or is it just a clever invention of those not gainfully employed? This question has been debated in universities and is being debated in universities all around the globe, and indeed in the pubs which surround them. Now, on the one side are these people who claim and who argue that we are very much still within the parameters of modernity. On the other are those who say that our understandings of ourselves and our world have undergone so much change, particularly in the last 50 years, as to warrant the use of this term postmodern. The problem is confounded when you think about some of these postmodern thinkers who refuse to accept this label of postmodern when applied to their work. So, where do we begin? What I want to talk about, or what I propose to do today, is to start off by looking at the notion of human consciousness. And I intend to do this very badly and very deficiently. The first thing to say is that consciousness is one of these hard problems facing those working in the area of philosophy today. What it is and how does it happen and so forth are some of the questions being debated by thinkers, again, all over the world. Now, we don't have time to enter into this important and very interesting debate. So when I use the term consciousness today, I want us to think about it in very loose terms. I'd like us to consider what we mean generally by consciousness, how it is we think in our generation about the world around us. So we're going to take a very quick drive through the evolution of human consciousness. Then I'm going to look at the notion of postmodernity and ask, does it exist? Do we have a right to claim that word? And then we look briefly at the notion of community before looking at the role of servant leaders in the context of community. And we're going to do all that in approximately 25 minutes, I hope. So, primal consciousness. Let's stretch our minds back thousands of years to what we call primal time, a time when human beings lived in small groups we refer to as tribes. The tribe gave the human being a way of belonging to a life that required hunting and gathering in order to survive. Anthropologists tell us that ritual played an important part in the life of these people as they bartered with spirits to provide food and shelter required to sustain life. All over the world, these people have left us signs of their presence on cave paintings depicting hunting scenes, in burial sites decorated with an amazingly diverse range of what we'd call today abstract patterns. They left few written records because writing wasn't required in their culture. So we were left wondering and speculating about the content of their headspace. What was it these people thought and how did they think? Now we're lucky in our attempts to answer this question because primal peoples have not completely disappeared from the earth. The Aborigines of Australia are a case in point. Some years ago I had the great honour of studying with a Roman Catholic priest from Australia who had spent his entire priestly life ministering to the Aborigines in northern Australia. In fact, over the course of his ministry, he had basically become an Aborigine. So his bishop, when he was accused of being quite unorthodox, his bishop said to him, "Well, I think the best thing you can do now, Wally, is get the hell out of my diocese and go and retrain in Christian theology. but they sent him to the wrong place. They sent him to Trinity College in Dublin. And when I had been, where I was then a student, where I had been as a young philosophy student looking at anthropology for the first time, I'd encountered this notion of the Aborigine dreaming that seemed to refer not only to the origins of life as the Aborigine thought, but also about how they understand the world around them today. One afternoon, while ensconced in a particularly comfortable pub in central Dublin called Doyle's, I recommend it if any of you are ever in the city centre of Dublin, I asked Wally, what is it that's meant by this notion of the dreaming? And he told me a story. He spent some time in Brisbane as a chaplain to Aboriginal prisoners. And there was one young boy there who had been confined to prison and found it very difficult to deal with the confinement and attempted to commit suicide. Thankfully, he didn't succeed, and he was put in the medical wing of the prison. When he became sufficiently well to go back to the main prison, Wally used to escort him each day to the medical unit to pick up his medication. And there was a corridor, which they refer to as the wall, that linked both parts of the prison. And you would go through one gate, it would lock behind you, Wally told me, and you waited in this long corridor with high walls of brick for the next gate to open. And one day, as they were waiting for the gate to open, this boy turned to Wally and said, "You know, Wally, this is my favourite part of the prison." And Wally said, "Why?" And he said, "Because up there's a tree." And he pointed to the top of the wall, and growing out of it was a weed. And this is what he said to Wally. "That tree is my brother. And each day I greet my brother, and my brother greets me. And my brother says, if I can live up there in a crack, then you can down there in the cell." For that boy, the world oozed transcendence. What he needed in order to sustain himself could be accessed through the most fragile manifestation of the natural world. And not even the very modern invention of the prison could hold him back. In my own native tongue, Irish, a language that has its origins among the Celtic tribes of Central Europe who spread out over the continent thousands of years ago, I find other intimations of this primal consciousness. In the Irish language, for instance, it is never possible to identify with a feeling. It is impossible to say, for instance, "I'm happy" or "I am sad." Emotional states are described as being on us, not in us. And the prayers of the ancient Irish were prayers to the gods and the goddesses of rivers and forests and breezes and sea and sky to ward off negative feelings by providing the simple fulfillments of food and shelter. The natural world provided transcendence and provided all that was required in order to survive physically and mentally. But something happened in history 2,000 years ago, and it happened simultaneously in different parts of the world. The first time I came across it was in this book by Karl Jaspers, the great German psychiatrist and philosopher working in the middle of the 20th century, in his book The Origin and Goal of History. Jaspers noted that between 800 BCE and 200 BCE, a change took place in human consciousness, so significant that, quote, "it gave birth to everything which since then humankind has been able to be." And he described this period as axial change. It was a change from primal consciousness to something altogether more modern looking. It was as if humankind started to spread out a little bit from the tribe, and tribes became larger in a move that would eventually lead to national identity. Written records began to emerge. Human beings became less concerned with their day-to-day survival as trade developed, and they started to speculate on the meaning of their individual identity. And in many ways, the individual was born. We see an early example of it with this man. No, not this man. This man. Homer. Homer, the great gypsy poet of ancient Greece. Here we see him with his rhythm stick in hand. Homer, we are told, was blind. He'd show up in town. The town itself being an early manifestation of this new age. Towns did not exist in primal times. He'd show up in town and he'd share the story of Odysseus and the Trojan War. Now, Odysseus was the very epitome of this axial change. Yes, he had loyalties and responsibilities to his tribe and to the other Greek tribes his tribe was affiliated to, but he also had the most extraordinary capacity for self-reflection. Not altogether dissimilar from that of Hamlet, who would tread the boards here in London 2,000 years later in 1600. This was the age, the Axial Age, when individual identity really started to express itself. People were not just part of the tribe, they had an individual identity. And not only in Greece, the Upanishads of India replaced the earlier Vedas, the Vedas being the stories of the mythological origins of the earth. The Upanishads replaced the Vedas as a philosophical discourse on our origins and on our destiny. The Upanishads gave us the sannyasam, the renunciate, practicing here the yoga, the way of renunciation, giving up material wealth in order to pursue his own enlightenment, something that would have been just impossible to consider in primal times. The axial period also gave us the Buddha, mapping out the way to nirvana, the annihilation of the ego. The goal in life for the Buddha was not shelter and food, it was freeing oneself from desires. Here we have Moses. I noticed Edward mentioned Moses earlier. This is Moses, a picture from the late 19th century by Joseph Tissot. Moses looking into the promised land. In the book of Deuteronomy, we hear Moses recall the time when the ancient Hebrews wandered in the desert. But he was to tell them, they were no longer wanderers. They were to be a settled people in this new land, and he gave them a law which focused on their individual responsibilities within this new national identity. The great prophet of Islam, Muhammad, peace be upon him, would later be the conduit for yet another law, a very similar law for the people of Arabia. Here we have the age of the philosopher. If you ever find yourself in Vatican City, you'll see this picture. It's known, its common name is Plato's Academy in ancient Athens. But in fact, it depicts philosophers from different periods within this axial period. The age of the philosopher was well and truly born. Humankind had this capacity to reason things out. They didn't rely on having to conduct ritual for a deity who was either going to supply shelter or food or not. They could use the rational faculty. I want to just mention, not because it's particularly pertinent, but because it's interesting in terms of voices which are being forgotten. There's a couple of very interesting people here. There. This guy here, this is Plato. And he's pointing towards the sky because he believed that through rational speculation, that if we thought things out, we could know the truth. Beside him is Aristotle. Aristotle is pointing down, saying that we need experience of life. We need empirical evidence and empirical facts to work stuff out. This guy is one of my favorite. He was Diogenes of Sinope, known as the great cynic of the ancient world. The word cynic comes from the Greek for dog, because cynics lived like dogs. Diogenes lived in a bathtub. It's said of Diogenes that one day, with the messenger from Philip of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great, sent a messenger to Diogenes saying, "Come and meet me." And Diogenes said to the messenger, well, he was sitting in his bathtub eating a bowl of lentils. And he said, "Why should I go and meet him?" And the messenger said, "Well, for one thing, if you learned to curry favor with the king, you wouldn't have to sit there eating a bowl of lentils." To which Diogenes replied, "Well, if you learned to eat lentils, you wouldn't have to curry favor with the king." This is, by far, I think, the most important character in this picture. This is Da Vinci Code territory. This is, in fact, a woman. She's the only woman represented in it. Her name was Hypatia of Alexandria, a great astronomer and mathematician. She was killed by a mob of Christian monks not long prior to the destruction of the great library in Alexandria, which we saw earlier. These people concentrated and focused on using the human mind to solve human problems. In the European context, what started in Greece was continued by Rome. And for all its savagery as a culture, Rome upheld the importance of philosophical reasoning. But the noble savage, depicted here in a Roman copy of an earlier Greek statue, the noble savage might be noble, but he had had his day in this classical philosophical world. Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, could not accommodate the noble savage, could not accommodate primal men and women. The name of this statue, in fact, is the Dying Galatian. But then history is never straightforward. Rome was to fall to the hands of northern European tribes who did not have the same tastes as the Romans. As the Roman Empire fell, it became transformed into a complex system of political alliances. Here on this island, when the Romans shut us shop, wished us well and sailed away, the Anglo Saxons arrived. And here in Londinium, as the Romans are called London, here in Londinium, the Anglo Saxons chose not to live in the Roman city, but established little villages in areas from what we now know as Covent Garden the whole way down to Westminster. We see, and I don't mean this as a judgment against the Anglo-Saxons, we see a move away from the urban lifestyles of the Romans to something much more agricultural, more simple, with less philosophy, and more trade. And this didn't just happen in Britain. It happened all over Europe, as Europe recalibrated itself away from the philosophical age towards a more hierarchical age, where we say welcome to what we know as the Dark Ages. But it wasn't to remain dark for too long. Now, it's wrong to use stereotypes and caricatures in academia, and I'm conscious I run the risk of doing so this afternoon with this sweeping survey of history. But it is important to record for our purposes that from the fall of Rome to the Renaissance, Europe experienced a serious paralysis when it came to philosophical discourse. A pattern emerges of agricultural life feeding into the trading systems of towns and cities, all managed by a very strict social hierarchy, and at the heart of that hierarchy was the church. And the church had a direct line to God. You didn't need to think, because God would let you know what he thought through his network of men in dresses. The truth was not arrived at through philosophical speculation, it was revealed. The ancient insights of Aristotle and Plato were on the verge of becoming lost forever, and we have one person to thank that they were not lost forever. And that was the Irish monk. I'm willing to take the applause. No. The Irish monks had created a network of monastic foundations across Europe where this ancient knowledge was preserved. And this is how we can quite rightly claim that it was the Irish who saved civilization. Because eventually, history would move on. And people, Renaissance meaning rebirth, was a rebirth of interest to these ancient letters. And the Renaissance led directly to this philosophical movement which we call the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment began with this guy, René Descartes, who on a cold winter's morning, we are told, in a little hut not far from where you are, in Holland, was kind of thinking, what is the fundamental nature of my existence here? And how can I prove I am? What gives me substance as an existence? And this is what he came up with. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And this is the point in our recent history. This is the birth of the modern age, one of the high points of the Enlightenment. I am because I think. Reason was to provide what philosophers call a meta-narrative. Don't be put off by that word. It was to provide a world view. That yes, humanity faced problems, but reason, the use of our rational faculty, had the capabilities of turning those problems, or finding solutions at least, to those problems. The French Revolution, with its emphasis on liberté, égalité, and fraternité, the French Revolution was one of the high points of the Enlightenment. And we have in a very symbolic moment the revolutionaries going into the Cathedral of Notre Dame and taking the statue of the Madonna out and replacing her with a statue of the goddess Reason. This was, their belief in the power of reason to make things better. Rousseau, one of the great thinkers behind revolutionary thought in France, Rousseau believed that the human being was so good, so capable of goodness, that we were on a trajectory towards a better future. Hobbes, another Enlightenment character, Hobbes had a more cynical view of what humankind were capable of, and gave us the notion of the Leviathan, that human societies needed the strong leader to lead them, because left leaderless, they were prone to do all sorts of interesting and wrong stuff. Here we have David Hume. We go back to that picture of Aristotle's Academy with with Plato pointing towards the sky, well, Hume would have done the opposite. Hume was a great father of British empiricism. We get to the truth by doing things. This is the empiricist's approach. We learn truth by doing things. Immanuel Kant, great father of European idealism. This is a war of ideas that Britain is still involved with in the continent. If you look at the row over Europe, these ideas are still being played out on our television sets every night. Kant, who again adopted a Platonic view of searching the mind for knowledge, for pure reason, as he referred to. Worth mentioning this woman, Mary Wollstonecraft. Hands up who has heard of Mary Wollstonecraft in this room? Not very many. Mary Wollstonecraft. Hands up who's heard of Mary Shelley? A few more people. Mary Wollstonecraft was the mother of Mary Shelley. There's no way to introduce her because I think she was a much more important person. She's known as the mother of British feminism. She lived not far from here, in the village of Newington Green, where she ran a girls' school. Just after the French Revolution, she spent time in Paris during the Revolution. She wrote a vindication of the rights of women, pointing out why women should be educated. But the reason I mention these people, all these people have been responsible for isms. Yeah? The rational age was about isms. This is what the Enlightenment is. We can make human life better through isms. So the Enlightenment, the modern thought of the Enlightenment gave us feminism, it gave us socialism, it gave us nationalism, it gave us communism. These are all the isms that the Enlightenment gave us. But then something awful happened that would question the ability of the Enlightenment, question the ability of reason to make things better. The Great War. The Great War and its horrendous destruction of human life has made us think that maybe reason is not a meta-narrative, it is not a worldview that works. And it is the death of reason as a worldview, as a meta-narrative, which is central to the postmodernists' claim. Now look, how can we as people look back on everything that has happened since the Enlightenment and write it off? Look at how modern thinking has changed the world for the better. All the things it has given us, from the telephone, to electricity, to almost universal education in Europe at least. The Enlightenment celebration of individual liberty has improved the quality of life for countless numbers of people and has given us a philosophical discourse in which to fight for the rights of other people. But what happened in our world in the 20th century and what is happening in our world today brings into focus the limitations of reason and the limitations of the project we call modernity. Today, we find ourselves in a culture with an endless array of choice. Anyone with children, by the time your child is 10, you're going to be able to identify over 100 of these corporate symbols and know what kind of service is linked to them. But ask a child in today's culture to identify this plant, and they're not going to be able to. This is something, by the way, the Anglo Saxons and primal peoples would have been. Does anyone know what this is, by the way? Any botanists? Well, this is St. John's wort, which was kind of the antidepressant of its day. Go and make tea out of that and be feeling great, let me tell you. Unable to identify these plants. And yet, at this particular moment in human history, one of the greatest problems facing us is the suffering of our planet and our inability to work together to address its problems. In the absence of meta-narratives which can bring us all together, black and white, Christian, Muslim, Jew, atheist, with a lack of a meta-narrative that can bring us all together, what are we to do? One possible way forward is community. I'm not going to talk very long about this, but I just want to try and incite you to think about the use of this term. In the postmodern age, people are suspicious because there's a sense that we've seen it all before. And in a capitalist culture, people are suspicious that the aims of capitalism want to sabotage and take hostage their good nature. And I, for one, do not want to see the notion of community turned into jargon in order to turn a profit for somebody. I think it's fundamentally too important, and I think it's fundamentally too necessary for our survival as a human race. The American philosopher Josiah Royce, who was born, I think, in the 1850s, died, I know, in 1916, an extraordinarily interesting man, friend of William James, a teacher of T.S. Eliot, whose office is just around the corner. Josiah Royce set his mind to exploring the balance between individual rights and the problems we face as collections of people. For Royce, the problem with modernity was an overemphasis on individualism. There is only one way to be an ethical individual, he wrote, and that is to choose a cause and serve it. The notion of loyalty is central to Royce's vision. And so too is this notion of community, because the truth for Royce lives only embryonically in the human being. In order for truth to grow into a tree, it needs to be shared and discussed and explored with other people in the context of a community. Now, the tool of modernity, in the age of reason, the tool for working things out reasonably, was to have a row, what we call dialectics in philosophy. That's a posh word for having a row. So we allowed ideas to go into conflict with each other. I think Hegel was the first to give us, the great German philosopher Hegel gave us this notion of the dialectic process, that one idea, a thesis, meets another, the antithesis, they clash and a synthesis is formed. But with modernity under the spotlight, when people not trusting it, I think it's probably worth our while looking at another way of communicating and another way of looking at truth. And this is particularly apparent when we notice all the voices which are missing in the predominant discourses in our society today. The absence, I look at the front bench of our government here in Britain, and I look at the schools and the universities they come from. And what voices are missing from there? Where are the voices of women? Where are the voices of ethnic minorities? Where are the voices of the poor? In our discussion on tackling global warming, where are the voices of those whose lives right now are being blighted by climate change? And why is it the only thing we can offer in response to that is a group of intellectual elites who will speak on other people's behalves? And if the task of education is not to absolutely tackle that world, and if the task of education is not to create leaders who can engage with those kind of questions, well then what is the task of education? And as people involved in education, if you think your only motivation is to teach people the ABCs of management, and with the greatest respect of human resource management, I don't like that term, of accountancy, well, how long do you think you're going to stay motivated in the job? There's a kind of a soulful agenda which we need to respond to. And the sufferings of the earth, the sufferings of the planet are setting that agenda, and we've no way out of it. I just want to bring my remarks to a close by talking about one of the concerns I have from the literature of servant leadership. And it's a discomfort which has been mentioned by other people earlier. And that is the idea that we should have a motivation to serve first. I'm very suspicious of people with a motivation to serve first. And I'm not just speaking as a person living in a post-Freudian world, but there is a level in which the desire to serve can mask a whole array of damaging thinking. And to find out what that damaging thinking is, it might be good to look at the opposite of what we mean by servant leader. Because the shadow of anything can be seen when we look at its opposite. And the shadow of the servant leader, I would suggest, is the narcissist. The person who is completely and utterly preoccupied with their own glorification and will use the services and work of others in order to achieve it. There's some people in whom this is not very well hidden. And they will walk over people in order to be glorified. But there are others in whom that is more hidden and is not quite apparent, but does emerge and it becomes damaging. And the first thing I would want to say about narcissism is that this is not something which other people suffer from. Narcissism is part of the human condition, which all of us have to deal with from time to time. And therefore, what I would like to suggest is that the starting point of servant leadership is not a recognition of our desire to serve, but rather a recognition of our brokenness and imperfections as human people. The story of Narcissus in Greek mythology, I'm always haunted by this, that when Narcissus fell in love with his reflection and fell into the lake and drowned, well, he left someone behind, Echo, this nymph who had fallen in love with him. And all Echo could do for eternity was to repeat what other people had said as she went in search of her love. And clearly the love, the care, and the support that Narcissus gave to Echo was not sufficient to create an autonomous learner, an independent person who occupying their own selfhood. He created a culture of dependency. So I think when we are looking at the theoretical context of servant leadership, part of this kind of stuff needs to be brought in. What I would possibly say is, one of the reasons I love America and stand up for it is because of the enlightenment which it gives, because of the optimism it gives to the world, because of its belief in humankind's progress, which is a very Enlightenment idea. But one of the shortcomings is that sometimes it's not pessimistic enough. Sometimes it's when I refer to America, I'm referring to an American culture which we're all part of, whether we like to admit it or not. That there does need to be a review of these motivations that bring people into leadership, so that when we become aware of our own shortcomings, that we don't project those shortcomings onto the people we purport to lead. So I'm conscious that we're running a little bit over time, and I shall leave it there, and I'll be happy to answer any questions which I think we're going to have from the panel now. So, thank you.